The first time Seth Townsend appeared in the doorway of Celia Hale's one-room schoolhouse, the autumn wind carried the smell of pine resin and distant rain, and every child in the room turned to look at the tall man in the worn leather duster who stood with his hat pressed flat against his chest like he was already in the presence of something sacred. Celia was 24 years old in the autumn of 1879, newly arrived in the small town of Granger's Hollow, Wyoming Territory, having accepted the position of schoolteacher after the previous one had packed her bags and left for Denver without so much as a farewell note pinned to the door. The schoolhouse itself was a modest building, 4 walls of rough-cut timber, a potbelly stove that groaned when the wind pushed against it, a blackboard that had seen better years, and 2 rows of split-log benches where 14 children sat in various states of fidgeting attention. It was not the life Celia had imagined for herself when she had graduated from the teacher's college in Cheyenne, but it was a life she had chosen, and she intended to make something worthy of it. She had been reading aloud from a geography primer, pointing to hand-drawn illustrations of river systems, when the door swung open and the shadow of a man fell across the pine-board floor. She turned, expecting perhaps the town magistrate or one of the fathers coming to pull a child home for harvest work. She did not expect what she saw. He was tall, broad in the shoulder, wearing a coat the color of old saddle leather, trousers tucked into boots that had clearly crossed a great many miles of unforgiving terrain. He was perhaps 28 or 29, with dark hair that curled slightly at the temples and eyes that caught the slant of afternoon light through the window and held it there, warm and serious all at once. He said nothing. He simply stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, looked at the room as if measuring whether he belonged in it, and then stepped quietly to the back wall, leaned his shoulders against it, and watched. Celia stared at him for a moment that stretched slightly too long, and one of her students, a girl named Mabel Perkins, turned around to see what her teacher was looking at. Celia caught herself, straightened her back, and returned her attention to the map in her hands. "The Platte River," she said, her voice steady, "flows eastward across the Nebraska Territory before joining the Missouri. Who can tell me what that river meant to the settlers moving westward?" She continued her lesson, but she could feel the man at the back of the room the way you feel a fire burning somewhere nearby, not close enough to be uncomfortable, but undeniably present. When the lesson ended and the children filed out into the afternoon light, laughing and chasing each other through the dry grass, the man at the back of the room put his hat back on his head, touched the brim in a gesture so quiet it was almost private, and walked out the door without a single word. Celia stood at the front of the empty room for a long moment, the geography primer still open in her hands, and she thought, well, that was entirely strange. She did not think much more of it that week. Granger's Hollow was a town that had grown up fast around a cattle trail, and men of all varieties passed through it regularly, men who were curious about everything and committed to nothing. She assumed he was one of them. She assumed she would never see him again. She was wrong. The following Friday, as she was drawing letters on the blackboard in the last afternoon hour before the school day ended, the door opened again. She turned, and there he was, the same man, same coat, same quiet way of moving, stepping to the back of the room and settling against the wall as if he had reserved that particular stretch of timber for himself. Children noticed him this time too, and a boy named Daniel Marsh whispered something to the girl beside him, and Celia gave them both a look that silenced the whispering immediately. She finished her lesson. He watched. When the children filed out, he tipped his hat again and left. This continued. Every Friday without fail as the afternoon lesson began, Seth Townsend would appear in the doorway of Celia's schoolhouse, step to the back wall, stand quietly through the full lesson, and leave when the children did. He never caused a disturbance. He never spoke to anyone. He simply watched with those warm, serious eyes, and Celia found herself increasingly unable to decide whether she was annoyed or intrigued, and that inability to decide was itself an answer that she was not quite ready to examine. By the third week, the children had accepted him the way children accept most things that present no immediate threat. Young Daniel Marsh had taken to giving the man a small nod of greeting when he arrived. Mabel Perkins had started sitting a little straighter on Fridays, which Celia suspected had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with the awareness that there was an audience. By the fourth week, Celia found herself planning her Friday lessons with slightly more care than usual. She told herself it was professional rigor. She dressed her hair a little differently on Fridays without meaning to. She mentioned the stranger to Margaret Yates, the woman who ran the boarding house where Celia rented a room, one evening over supper. Margaret was a woman of 53 who had lived in Granger's Hollow longer than the town had a proper name, and who knew every soul in the county in the way that only people who run boarding houses and general stores ever truly know their neighbors. "Tall fellow," Margaret said immediately. "Dark hair, rides a gray gelding with one white ear." "I couldn't say about the horse," Celia admitted, "but tall and dark-haired, yes." "That would be Seth Townsend," Margaret said, passing the bread across the table. "He runs cattle on the old Drummond spread about 4 miles east of town. Good land, that. He bought it off old Henry Drummond 2 years ago. Nobody expected him to stick around, but he has." "Why wouldn't he stick around?" Celia asked, keeping her voice carefully neutral. Margaret looked at her in the way of women who have seen a great many things and are amused to see them repeating. "He's not from here originally. Came up from Texas, so the story goes. Had some kind of trouble down there, nobody knows exactly what kind, and he rode north and just kept riding until he hit Granger's Hollow. People assumed he would keep riding, but he didn't." "And what kind of man is he?" Celia asked. "In terms of character?" "Honest," Margaret said without hesitation. "Quiet, pays his debts before they are due. Helped 4 families get their cattle to market last spring when the Kavanaugh brothers tried to block the trail. Doesn't drink to excess, doesn't gamble beyond what's social, keeps to himself mostly." She paused. "Why do you ask?" "He stands in the back of my classroom every Friday," Celia said, "and he hasn't explained himself." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled in a way that rearranged her entire face. "Has he not?" she said, not as a question. "I find it peculiar," Celia said. "I imagine you do," Margaret said, and would say nothing more on the subject, which Celia found both maddening and illuminating. The following Friday, when the door opened and Seth Townsend stepped into the room, Celia had a specific lesson prepared. She had been reading about astronomy from a book she had ordered from a publisher in Philadelphia, and she had stayed up 2 evenings drawing a careful illustration of the solar system on a large sheet of brown paper. She pinned it to the blackboard and told her students about the planets, about the distances between them, about the fact that the light from some stars had been traveling so long that the star itself might already be gone by the time that light reached your eye. She spoke more carefully than usual. She chose her words with a precision she normally reserved for written letters. She did not look at the back of the room, but she was acutely aware of the quality of attention coming from that direction, something different from the fidgeting half-attention of children, something that felt like being genuinely listened to by someone who understood that what she was saying mattered. When the lesson ended and the children left, Celia remained at the blackboard. She heard him move toward the door, and then, surprising herself entirely, she turned. "You have been coming here for 4 weeks," she said, her voice even and clear, the voice she used when she wanted to say something that meant business. "And you have not introduced yourself or offered any explanation for your presence. I would like one, if you please." He stopped. He turned back to face her, and for the first time she had a full, clear look at his face, without the distraction of managing a room full of children. He was handsome in a way that was serious rather than pretty, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut rather than grown, and a mouth that seemed to be considering things even when it was not speaking. There was something in his expression she could not quite name, something that sat between embarrassment and steadiness. "I apologize," he said. His voice was low and careful, a voice that had not been used carelessly. I should have introduced myself before now. My name is Seth Townsend. I run the drum and spread east of town. I know who you are, Celia said. I am asking why you are here. He was quiet for a moment that felt much longer than it was. When I was a boy, he said finally, I did not have much schooling. My father pulled me out of school at 8 years old because he needed hands. I worked cattle for 20 years and I read what I could when I could, but there is a great deal I never learned properly. He paused. I heard there was a new schoolteacher in town, someone from the college in Cheyenne. And I have been riding past the schoolhouse on Fridays anyway, coming back from the grain merchant, and the first time I heard you teaching through the open window, I stopped my horse. He stopped, and his jaw tightened slightly, as if the next words required a particular effort. I just wanted to hear it done properly, he said. Learning done properly by someone who knows what they are doing. I did not mean any intrusion. I should have asked permission. Celia looked at him for a long moment. She had expected something stranger, something she would have to decide how to handle firmly. She had not expected this. She had not expected this particular kind of honesty, plainly delivered, without ornament or apology beyond what was genuinely necessary. You are welcome to come closer, she said. There is no reason to stand at the back of the room, Mr. Townsend. If you want to learn, I am a teacher. That is, in fact, exactly what I am here for. Something shifted in his expression, a small thing, hardly visible but present. I did not want to disturb the children, he said. Then come early on Friday afternoons, she said, before the lesson begins. I will set aside 30 minutes in which you may ask whatever questions you have, and we can address the gaps in your education without an audience of 14 children watching. He looked at her for another moment. That is a very generous offer, he said. It is a practical one, she said, though her heart was doing something slightly unreasonable inside her chest. I do not like seeing knowledge go wanting when I am in a position to provide it. Come next Friday at 2 o'clock before the children arrive at 1:30. He turned his hat in his hands once. I will be here at 2, he said. Then he put his hat on, touched the brim, and walked out into the late afternoon. Celia stood in the empty classroom and pressed her hands flat against the surface of the desk. She was not sure what she had just done, but she suspected it was the most interesting thing she had done since arriving in Granger's Hollow. He arrived at precisely 2 o'clock the following Friday, which somehow did not surprise her at all. He tethered his gray gelding to the post outside, the horse with one white ear exactly as Margaret had described, and he came through the door holding his hat and looking around the classroom the way a man looks at a room when he is trying to decide if he deserves to be in it. Celia had arranged a chair at the front, beside the desk rather than behind it. She gestured to it and he sat, which looked somewhat comical because the chairs were built for children, and his long legs had to fold at an angle. But he did not comment on this, and neither did she, and they got on with it. She asked him what he knew and what he did not, and he answered honestly, which she was coming to understand was simply his nature. He could read, though not quickly. He could do basic arithmetic but had never been taught algebra or any formal mathematics beyond addition and subtraction. He knew geography in the practical sense, the kind you learn from riding across it, but had no framework of history or science into which to place that knowledge. He was embarrassed about none of this, which she found admirable. He simply stated the facts of his education the way he would state the condition of a fence line, not with shame, but with the clear-eyed assessment of something that needed work. She gave him a reader and a set of arithmetic problems to work on during the week. He took both with a seriousness that made her feel her work was genuinely valued. When the children began arriving at 2:30, he moved to the back of the room as he always had. But now he listened differently, with context, with prior conversation, and she found herself occasionally directing a question toward the back of the room that was too advanced for the children but aimed somehow at him. He never answered aloud during the children's lessons, but his eyes would shift when she asked the right question, and there would be something in them that told her he was working through it, turning it over in his mind like a stone to see what was underneath. The weeks turned and the pattern established itself, and Granger's Hollow took note, as small towns always do. Margaret Yates said nothing but smiled to herself over the dinner table with increasing frequency. The grain merchant, a man named Aloysius Prout who kept his ear in everything, mentioned to 3 separate customers that Seth Townsend had taken to visiting the schoolhouse on Fridays. The sheriff, a heavy-set good-natured man named Bert Calhoun, stopped Seth in the street one afternoon and asked him with a broad grin whether he had learned to read yet. Seth told him that he had always been able to read, and then walked on before the conversation could go any further. Celia heard all of this through the peculiar social osmosis of a small town, where information traveled through women's conversation and men's silence in roughly equal measure. She found that she minded the attention less than she would have expected. What she minded was the reduction, the sense that people were watching something simple and predictable, when what was actually happening in her classroom on Friday afternoons was anything but. Because Seth Townsend was not a simple man to teach. He was, in fact, one of the most intellectually alive students she had ever encountered, and she had taught in Cheyenne for a year before coming to Granger's Hollow and had seen a broad range of minds. He asked questions that went sideways and then turned out to be exactly the right direction. He made connections across subjects she had not thought to connect. When she explained the science of river formation, using the Platte as an example, he had looked at her and said, "So the land is written over time, the way a letter is written, except the pen is water." And she had stood very still for a moment because that was not just a correct understanding. That was an insight that went beyond what she had been teaching. She found herself doing something she had been careful not to do, which was looking forward to Fridays with an intensity that had nothing to do with pedagogical duty. He, in turn, had begun to show up on Friday mornings to clear the snow from the schoolhouse steps before she arrived, because November had come and with it the first real cold, the kind that meant business. She had discovered this the second Friday of November, stepping out of Margaret's boarding house in the gray morning light and finding the path to the schoolhouse already swept, and the small storm of emotion she had felt at this discovery was something she had packed carefully down and told herself to be sensible about. She mentioned it to him the following Friday at their 2 o'clock lesson, asked if it had been him. He had looked at the arithmetic problem in front of him and said yes, because the steps were icy and he did not want one of the children to fall. "That is very thoughtful," she said. "It is practical," he said, without looking up, and she recognized her own word from their first real conversation returned to her, and she pressed her lips together to keep from smiling. The first real conversation they had that was not structured around a lesson happened in late November, when the stove had been struggling all afternoon, and one of the older children had accidentally knocked the damper loose, and Seth had spent 20 minutes lying on his back beside the stove while she handed him tools, and the children watched with avid interest. He had fixed the damper, and then they had both sat in the warm glow of the restored fire while the children packed up their slates and filed out, and neither of them got up immediately, and the conversation had begun without anyone deciding to begin it. He asked her where she was from originally. She told him Ohio, a small town outside of Columbus, the youngest daughter of a minister who had believed that women deserved the same education as men, a belief sufficiently unusual in that world that she was still grateful for it every day. She had gone to Teachers College on a scholarship offered by the Wyoming Territorial government, which was more progressive on the subject of women's education than most places, and had found she loved teaching with a fierceness that had surprised her. "What brought you here?" he asked, Granger's Hollow specifically. "I needed a position," she said, "and this was the one that was available. The previous teacher left without warning." "Martha Collier," he said. "She married a railroad man from Denver. Good man, I'm told." "Do you miss having a teacher here?" she asked, Before I arrived, the children had been without formal schooling for almost 3 months. The children needed someone, he said. I think they still needed someone by the time you came. There was something in the way he said it that made her look at him more carefully. What about you? She asked. Did you need someone? He looked at the stove for a moment. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind had begun to pick up and the last of the November light was fading. I needed something, he said. I am not sure I knew what to call it. She said nothing to that, because nothing she could think of to say felt adequate, and the silence between them was the kind that does not require filling. December arrived with serious intent. The snows came down from the mountains and covered the high ground and made the roads into long white challenges. And still Seth came every Friday at 2 o'clock, tethering his horse outside and appearing in the doorway with snow on the shoulders of his coat and his cheeks reddened by cold. And Celia found herself watching for the shape of him through the window in a way that she had stopped pretending was anything other than what it was. She had by this point learned, through the slow accumulation of conversation, a considerable amount about his life. He had grown up in the Texas Hill Country, one of 4 boys, his father a man who worked hard and loved his sons in the particular way of men who demonstrate love through expectation rather than tenderness. His mother had died when he was 12, and the world had reorganized itself around that absence in ways he described without sentimentality, but with a precision that suggested he had thought about it a great deal over the years. He had worked cattle from the time he could sit a horse, and he had spent most of his 20s as a trail hand, moving cattle along the various routes northward, sleeping under stars, developing the kind of self-sufficiency that trail life produces in those it does not break. The trouble in Texas, which Margaret had mentioned and which Celia had not pressed about, he told her about himself in December. On the Friday, the first serious blizzard kept the children from school entirely, but which he had ridden through anyway because, as he said with perfect plainness, he had made a commitment to be there at 2. There had been a land dispute. A powerful ranching family called the Aldridges had wanted his father's land and had found legal means, barely legal means, to take it. Seth had been in his mid-20s, already working cattle far from home, and by the time the news reached him, the land was gone and his father was living with Seth's eldest brother in a one-room house that fit neither of them comfortably. Seth had gone back and there had been a confrontation, and it had not turned violent but it had been close, and Seth had said things to powerful men in a public street that resulted in his finding the atmosphere of that county somewhat inhospitable thereafter. So you rode north, Celia said. I rode north, he confirmed. And kept riding. Until Granger's Hollow, he said, until I found a piece of land that was available and could be worked and decided that this was far enough. Do you regret leaving? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. The blizzard pressed against the windows and the stove kept the room in a pocket of warmth that felt separate from the world. I used to, he said. I thought I should have fought harder, found a lawyer, done something more. He paused. But I was 25 and angry, and anger is a poor legal strategy, and the Aldridges were very well connected. I am not sure I could have changed the outcome, even if I had stayed. He looked at the desk between them. What I know now that I did not know then is that the best thing I could have done was exactly what I did. Build something of my own somewhere they couldn't touch it. She looked at him for a moment. That is a very mature conclusion for someone to have reached, she said. I have had 4 years of riding and working, and doing a great deal of thinking to reach it, he said. She pushed a new arithmetic problem across the desk, one she had prepared to move him into a more complicated kind of calculation. He looked at it, and then at her with an expression she was beginning to learn, the particular look he got when something had shifted in him, and he was not quite sure what to do with the shift. Celia, he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and neither of them acknowledged it directly, but both of them felt it. Would you consider having supper with me sometime? In town, at Mrs. Lavery's dining room, in a proper public setting. She had thought about this possibility, had turned it over in her mind, had examined it from several angles. She was the town's schoolteacher, and in 1879 in the Wyoming Territory, a woman in that position held a particular kind of responsibility for propriety. The school board, which consisted of 3 men including the magistrate, had the power to dismiss her if they felt her personal conduct reflected poorly on the institution. She was aware of this. She was also aware that Seth Townsend was a man of unimpeachable local reputation, that supper at Mrs. Lavery's was a thoroughly respectable activity, and that she had been aware of wanting to say yes to exactly this question for somewhere between 4 and 6 weeks. "I would consider it a very good idea," she said. The smile that crossed his face was brief and slightly astonished, as if he had prepared for a longer campaign. It was, she thought, the most honestly attractive thing she had ever seen on a person's face. They had supper at Mrs. Lavery's dining room on a Thursday evening in the 2nd week of December, and it was everything a proper supper was supposed to be, and also something more. The dining room smelled of wood smoke and roast beef, and the other diners were discreet enough to confine their observation to glances, and Seth had dressed in a clean dark coat, and a collar that showed he had made an effort, and Celia had worn her blue wool dress, the one with the small ivory buttons at the collar, and had done her hair with more care than usual. They talked for 3 hours. The food was consumed at some point and dishes came and went, but the conversation was the real substance of the evening. She told him about the books she had read, the ones that had shaped her, the way she had come to believe that education was not just information but a kind of liberation, that it changed how a person understood the terms of their own life. He listened to this with an attentiveness that was almost physical, as if he were memorizing it. He told her about the cattle, about the particular satisfaction of managing a piece of land well, watching it respond to good care. He had 30 head now and was building toward 100. He had plans for the spring, a larger pasture fenced in, a second water trough. He spoke about his work the way she spoke about hers, with the specific love of someone doing something they have chosen freely. "My father thought cattle work was just labor," he said. "Something you did because you had no choice. I think he was wrong about that. I think it can be a craft. I think most things can be crafts if you approach them with enough attention." She looked at him across the table and thought, "This is the problem with you, Seth Townsend. You keep saying things that are exactly right." Snow had deepened outside by the time they left the dining room, and he walked her back to Margaret's boarding house through the quiet, cold street, their breath visible in the lantern light, and at the door of the boarding house he stopped and said very simply, "Thank you for saying yes to supper." "Thank you for asking," she said. "I would like to ask again," he said. "Not just to supper, to walking sometimes and talking. I would like to keep talking to you, Celia." She looked at him for a moment in the cold, yellow light. "I would like that too," she said. He walked back through the snow toward where he had stabled his horse, and she watched him go. And Margaret, who had been absolutely not watching from the parlor window, made no comment at breakfast the following morning, but refilled Celia's tea without being asked, which was her particular way of communicating approval. Winter in Granger's Hollow was a thing unto itself, a season that stripped the landscape down to its essential elements and tested the character of everyone in it. The snow could close roads for days. The temperature could drop in hours from cold to dangerous. The town moved in a slower rhythm, conserving warmth and resources, and the social life of the community contracted inward in the way it always did in winter, people gathering in fewer places with more intention. Seth and Celia walked when the weather permitted, along the main street in the early evenings, and when it did not permit, they sat in the parlor of Margaret's boarding house, at the large table, with a propriety that satisfied convention while allowing them the particular intimacy of extended quiet presence. Margaret would sew at the other end of the table and occasionally make contributions to the conversation, and the 3 of them developed a comfortable rhythm that suited all parties. On one of these evenings, Seth brought a letter he had written to his eldest brother in Texas and asked Celia to read it and tell him if the language was correct. She read it carefully. The language was correct, more than correct. It was a letter of genuine feeling, plainly expressed, telling his brother that he was well, that the land was good, that he had found something in Wyoming that he had not known he was looking for. She handed it back without comment on that particular sentence, but she felt it settle somewhere in her chest and stay there. She had been writing letters back to Ohio during this time, to her father and her two older sisters, and she had been increasingly honest in those letters about the nature of her Friday afternoons and what had grown from them. Her father had written back, characteristically, with a biblical quotation and a practical question about whether the man was solvent. Her sister Ruth had written back with several pages of enthusiastic questions. Her sister Anna had written back asking for a description of his physical appearance, which Celia answered in measured but honest terms. Christmas came to Granger's Hollow with a community supper in the town hall and a school pageant that Celia organized with great determination and only moderate chaos. Seth attended both events, and at the community supper they danced together twice, which was the maximum propriety permitted a couple not formally engaged, and both times Celia found that being in his orbit when his hand was at her waist and his eyes were on her face produced a state of mind that she was no longer interested in arguing with. After the second dance, they stepped outside into the cold for a few minutes, standing at the edge of the light from the hall windows, and she could hear the music continuing inside, and the voices of people she had come to know in the 4 months she had lived in Granger's Hollow. "I want to tell you something," he said, and his voice was a different tone than usual, lower, more careful. "I want to tell you before I lose the nerve because I have been carrying it around for some weeks now." She waited. "I came to your classroom that first Friday," he said, "because I heard you teaching through the window. That is true. But I kept coming back for reasons that had nothing to do with education by the second week, and by the time you invited me closer, I was not sure I was going to be able to keep pretending it was about the lessons." She looked at him, at the serious warm eyes in the cold light, at the composed deliberateness of his expression. "Seth," she said, "by the second week, I was planning my Friday lessons with considerably more care than they required. I was also wearing my better dress on Fridays." He looked at her for a moment, something loosened in his expression. "Your blue dress?" he asked. "My blue dress," she confirmed. "I noticed the blue dress," he said quietly. "I know," she said. He reached up and very slowly, very deliberately, with the kind of steadiness that was simply his nature, brushed a strand of hair back from her cheek with 2 fingers. His touch was light and certain at once, and the cold air and the distant music and the lamplight from the windows made the whole thing feel like something that would be told afterward, the kind of moment that accumulates into the story of 2 people. "I believe I am thoroughly in love with you," he said. "I wanted to say it plainly because I do not think it does either of us any good for me to leave it unsaid." "I believe I am thoroughly in love with you," she said back, because she was a schoolteacher and she believed in precision, and have been for some time and also found it somewhat inconvenient. He laughed then, a real laugh, not his quiet smile but a genuine full sound, and she thought she had never heard anything better. January in the Wyoming Territory was a trial by cold and isolation, and it forged things. The romance between Celia Hale and Seth Townsend was forged by it into something harder and more certain than the tender, uncertain feeling of those first weeks. They were not uncertain anymore. Seth proposed the following considerations in early January. He was a man building a cattle operation from the ground up. His house was currently a 2-room structure that was solid but small. He intended to build it larger in the spring. He was not wealthy, but he was not in debt, and he intended to remain not in debt. And he was 30 years old and had not been in love before and had not expected to be, and was entirely serious about it now. He did not frame these as reasons she should or should not accept anything. He framed them as honest information, the way he did everything, so that she could make whatever decision she made with a full understanding of what she was deciding. She listened to all of this at the parlor table at Margaret's boarding house, on a Tuesday evening in January with the snow falling outside and Margaret conspicuously absent, having retired early with a headache that appeared to be primarily diplomatic in nature. "Seth," she said when he had finished, "are you trying to propose to me or prepare a financial statement?" He looked at her. "Both somewhat," he admitted. "I thought you deserved the full picture." "I appreciate the full picture," she said. "I appreciate it enormously. Now ask me properly." He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into the pocket of his jacket and produced a ring, a simple thing, a band of silver with a small turquoise stone set in it, which she later learned he had bought from a Shoshone craftsman who came through town in autumn trading, and he held it between his fingers and looked at her. "Celia Hale," he said, "I would very much like to spend the rest of my life in the same general direction as you, if you are willing." She pressed her lips together to manage herself. "In the same general direction," she repeated. "It seemed more accurate than some of the alternatives," he said. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." He slid the ring onto her finger and she looked at the turquoise, the color of sky in summer, the color of something that knew what it was. They told Margaret first, who received the news with an expression of absolute unsurprise and immediately offered sherry, which she produced from a cabinet that Celia had not previously known existed. They told the sheriff the following day, who shook Seth's hand for a considerable time, and told Celia she had done the whole territory a service. The school board was informed formally by letter, which prompted a meeting at which the magistrate, a man named Jonas Beckett, wanted to discuss whether a married woman could continue teaching school. This meeting was one of the less pleasant events of that winter. Jonas Beckett was a man with strong views about the appropriate division of responsibilities between the sexes, and he communicated these views at length and with confidence. Celia attended the meeting herself, which Jonas Beckett had not anticipated, and she addressed the board for 30 minutes on the subject of her qualifications, her record in Granger's Hollow, the improvement in attendance and performance among the children in her care, and the absence of any contractual language prohibiting a teacher from entering matrimony. She also pointed out that 2 of the 3 board members had wives who had taught school before marriage, and that it had not, as far as she was aware, retroactively diminished the quality of their education. The 3rd board member, a younger man named Paul Garrett who had 2 daughters in Celia's class, said that he saw no reason to lose the best teacher the school had ever had on the basis of her marital status, and that the children's education should be the board's concern, and that he moved to table the discussion. The motion passed. Celia would continue to teach. She told Seth about the meeting that Friday, and his jaw tightened in that particular way it had when something angered him that he was not going to act on precipitously. "I could speak to Beckett," he said. "You absolutely will not," she said. "I handled it. It is handled. I do not need you to speak to anyone on my behalf unless I specifically ask you to." He looked at her. "Understood," he said, and she believed him because he was a man who meant what he said. There was, in the fabric of those winter months, a quality of happiness that Celia had not known before, not happiness as an absence of difficulty, because the difficulties were real and present, the cold and the distance and the limitations of a small-town life in 1879, but happiness as a deep orientation toward something, the sense of moving toward rather than merely through. She was building something. 2 things, actually, a school and a life, and both of them felt real and solid in her hands. Seth was also building, in that literal sense. In February, on the warmer days, he began working with 2 men from town, brothers named Carlos and Emilio Vasquez, who had been working ranch labor in the territory for several years, on an addition to the house on the Drummond spread. He had explained his plans to Celia carefully. The existing 2 rooms would become the kitchen and a sitting room, and the new structure would add a proper parlor, a bedroom, and a room he described simply as the study, intended for books and learning. She had looked at him when he said this. "A study," she said. "For books," he repeated, with the particular look he had when he was saying something that mattered and not elaborating on it. "That is a very thoughtful thing to build into a house," she said. "It seemed necessary," he said. They were married on the first Saturday of March 1880, when the weather had softened just enough to feel like promise. The ceremony was performed by the circuit preacher, a man named Father David Winslow, who traveled the territory on a schedule that was more aspirational than reliable, but who had been written to in November, and who appeared, gratifyingly, on the correct Saturday. The wedding took place in the church that also served as the town meeting hall, and was attended by most of Granger's Hollow and a significant fraction of the surrounding ranching community. Celia wore a dress of ivory cotton with eyelet trim that she and Margaret had made together over the preceding 2 months, sewing in the evenings by lamplight, with Ruth's advice arriving by letter from Ohio. Her hair was done simply, pinned back with 2 small combs that had belonged to her mother. She walked into the church and saw Seth standing at the front, straight as a fence post in his dark coat, and the expression on his face when he saw her was something she thought she would be able to call up from memory for the rest of her life, the look of a man who could not entirely believe his own good fortune. The vows they exchanged were the traditional ones, and when she said, "I do," her voice was clear and steady, and when he said, "I do," his voice was lower than usual but equally steady, and the presiding question of whether any person objected went unanswered, which was satisfying to everyone. Margaret Yates cried with great dignity. Daniel Marsh, who was 13 and thought of himself as beyond such displays, was observed wiping his face on his sleeve. The Vasquez brothers stood together near the back of the church and applauded more enthusiastically than was strictly conventional, and Celia found this entirely charming. They ate the wedding supper at the town hall, where the community had contributed dishes in the customary way, and the whole affair had the quality of something that was less a formal event than a collective acknowledgement of something everyone in Granger's Hollow had been watching develop and was glad to see properly established. That evening, when the celebration had wound down and the stars had come out in the enormous Wyoming sky, Seth drove them in his wagon toward the Drummond spread, now legally and entirely theirs, and Celia sat beside him on the bench with his arm around her and her head against his shoulder and the cold air biting at her cheeks, and she thought that the distance between where she had been and where she was now was so vast it could not be measured in miles. "Are you warm enough?" he asked. "I am perfectly warm," she said. "The addition is finished," he said. "The study has 3 shelves. I hope that is enough to begin." She tilted her head to look at him. In the moonlight his profile was clear and still. "3 shelves," she said. "That will be more than enough to begin." The house, when they arrived, was warm because Seth had arranged for Carlos Vasquez to light the stove that afternoon. The study was indeed finished, 3 pine shelves fixed to the wall, empty and waiting. She ran her hand along the wood, feeling the careful sanding he had done, the smoothness of it, and she felt something so strong it had no single name, gratitude and love and the specific gladness of being known by someone. She turned and found him in the doorway of the study, watching her, and she crossed the room and kissed him with her whole self in it, and the empty shelves and the warm house and the enormous Wyoming night outside formed the perimeter of a world that felt exactly large enough. Spring came to Granger's Hollow with the particular ferocity of places where winter has held on too long, a burst of green and warmth that seemed almost argumentative after the months of cold. The cattle on their spread responded to it, moving more freely in the expanded pasture Seth had fenced in over the winter's milder days, and the calves that had been born in the worst of February now wobbled on increasingly steady legs in the morning light. Celia continued to teach, driving herself and Seth's spare horse into town on school mornings, a routine that had taken no more than a few days to feel natural. The children had adjusted to her new name, mostly, though Mabel Perkins had initially appeared confused by the transition and then had asked, with the directness of children who have not yet learned to be indirect, whether Mr. Townsend had been coming to school because he liked their teacher. Celia had said, with the same directness, that yes, he had, and that it had turned out rather well, and Mabel had nodded with great satisfaction. There were complications, as there always were in a life being built from the ground up. The spring of 1880 brought with it a dispute over water rights on the eastern side of the spread, where a creek ran through a corner of their land, and a neighboring rancher named Harold Wick claimed prior use rights to the water. Seth handled this with characteristic patience, engaging the county surveyor and producing the deed paperwork with the calm thoroughness of a man who understood that the answer to most disputes was documentation. The dispute was resolved in their favor by summer, and Harold Wick accepted the resolution with poor grace but without further action, and the creek went on running exactly where it had always run. There were also the joys, and these were not small things. The Saturday mornings when the work could wait, and they sat at the kitchen table with their coffee and the week's newspaper from Cheyenne, reading aloud to each other the stories that seemed worth discussing. The evenings when Seth sat in the study with the books she had been assigning him, working through them with the focused intensity he brought to everything, and she would look up from her own reading to find him frowning at a page, and she would ask what was the problem, and they would be off into a conversation that lasted until the lamp oil ran low. He read everything she gave him and formed opinions about all of it, which she found endlessly satisfying. He had strong opinions about history, particularly the history of land and settlement in the West, which was perhaps inevitable given the particulars of his own story. He was fascinated by astronomy, the subject that had been on the blackboard the day he had first spoken to her, and she ordered more books on the subject from the Philadelphia publisher, which arrived weeks later having been routed through Cheyenne and then by stage, and he read them cover to cover within days. "The universe is so much bigger than anything we ever have to worry about," he said once, looking up from one of the astronomy books in the evening light. "I find that comforting, strangely." "I have always found it comforting," she said. "It puts the water rights dispute with Harold Wick in appropriate perspective." He laughed. She stored the sound of his laughter carefully, as she had learned to do, because it was not freely given and was therefore worth more. In the early summer of 1880, Celia discovered she was pregnant, and told Seth on a Tuesday evening sitting on the porch of their house in the long golden light that July produced in Wyoming, where the sun set late and the shadows went purple before they went dark. She told him simply, because simplicity was the language they shared, and she watched his face move through something, surprise, and then something so much larger than surprise that she could not find a word for it in any of the languages she knew. He put his hand over hers on the porch rail and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "How are you feeling?" "Well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, but well." "Good," he said, and his voice was rough in a way that had nothing to do with illness. "That is very good." She taught through the summer and into the autumn, adjusting the school schedule to accommodate the harvest season which pulled the older children away, and accommodating her own changing physical situation with the matter-of-fact practicality that she applied to most things. Margaret Yates came out to the spread twice a week through the autumn to help with the domestic work, having declared herself an interested party in the proceedings without being asked, and Seth had at some point arranged for Carlos and Emilio Vasquez to take on extra work in the mornings so that he could be available in the house more frequently. A rearrangement he accomplished without telling her, and which she discovered, and which made her feel a complex mixture of annoyance at his not consulting her and tenderness at his having thought of it. "I can manage," she said when she discovered the rearrangement. "I know you can," he said. "I am not managing you. I am being nearby." She looked at him for a moment. "Being nearby," she repeated. "In case you want me," he said, "not because you need me." She put down the dish she had been holding and crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him, which was becoming more physically complicated but no less satisfying, and he held her with the gentleness and certainty that was entirely his own, and she thought that the man who had stood at the back of her classroom, because he did not know if he deserved to take up space, and it had come a very great distance. Their son was born on the 15th of December, 1880, delivered by the town doctor, a steady-handed woman named Dr. Helen Price, who had come to Granger's Hollow from Philadelphia in 1878, and whose presence in the town was a fact that Celia had been grateful for every day since her arrival. Dr. Price was calm and competent and did not waste anyone's time, and the birth, though long and demanding, went well. And at the end of it Seth was permitted into the room, and he sat beside the bed and held his son, who was red-faced and loudly indignant about existence, and he looked down at the child with an expression that made Celia understand that the word love was doing an insufficient job. They named him James after Seth's father, with the middle name William after Celia's father. James William Townsend arrived in Granger's Hollow with considerable noise and rapidly made his presence central to everything. He was a child of great curiosity, which pleased both of his parents enormously. By the time he was old enough to sit upright, he was intensely interested in the world around him, reaching for everything, watching with the same concentrated attention that his father had once applied to blackboards. By the time he was walking, he was already spending time in the study, pulling books from the lower shelves and examining them with tremendous seriousness. Celia returned to teaching in the spring after James's birth, bringing him with her for the first months when he was small enough to sleep in a basket beside the desk, a situation the children found absolutely delightful and which introduced a new category of educational distraction that she managed with patience. The years moved forward in the particular way of years in which things are good, quickly, but not without their substance. The spread grew. Seth brought the herd to 120 head by 1882, and the following year added a proper barn to replace the Linta structure that had served on the Drummond land. The Carlos and Emilio Vasquez became reliable permanent hands, and their families added to the social fabric of the spread and the town. And Celia took a particular interest in ensuring that the Vasquez children had the same access to the school as every other child in Granger's Hollow, which required a conversation with Jonas Beckett that she handled with the same precise determination she had brought to the earlier board meeting, and with a similar outcome. The inequalities of that territory and that time were real and present. There were ranchers who treated their Mexican hands as something less than full men, and there were townspeople who drew invisible lines around what kinds of families belonged in what kinds of places. Celia was a schoolteacher, and her position at the front of a classroom gave her a particular leverage, small in the broad scale of things but entirely real in the specific lives of the children she taught. She used it. She made her classroom a place where every child sat at the same level, where every question received the same serious answer, where the history she taught included the complexity of what the settling of the West had meant for people who were already there. She taught it honestly, without sentimentality in either direction, the way she believed truth deserved to be taught. Seth supported all of this without reservation, which she had not taken for granted and never did. There were men in Granger's Hollow who thought her curriculum was too complicated for a schoolteacher's business, who thought that children needed reading and arithmetic and not the rest of it. Seth, when asked his opinion at the grain merchant's or the hardware store, consistently said that his wife was the educated professional in the room, and he deferred to her judgment on the subject of what children should be taught, which was both exactly right and also drove Jonas Beckett to an ongoing low-level simmer that Celia found privately entertaining. In the winter of 1883, Celia found herself pregnant again, and this time she told Seth in the study, where he was reading by lamplight while James, now 3 years old, slept in the other room. She sat down across from him and said, "I have something to tell you," and he looked up from his book and she told him. He put the book down. "Is everything well?" he asked first as he had the first time. "Everything is well," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "James is going to be absolutely insufferable about this," he said. She laughed. "He will be, yes." He stood up and came around the desk and crouched in front of her chair and took both of her hands. "I did not think," he said, his voice quiet, "when I was riding into Granger's Hollow that first time that this was what was waiting here. Any of this." "What did you think was waiting?" she asked. "Cattle and hard winters," he said. "A life I could manage without being broken by it." She leaned her forehead against his. "And instead," she asked. "And instead," he said, "considerably more than that." Their daughter was born in September of 1883, and they named her Ruth, after Celia's sister in Ohio, with the middle name Alina after Seth's mother, whom he had lost and carried quietly with him through all the years since. Ruth Alina Townsend was from her first weeks a child of strong opinions, which anyone who knew her parents could have predicted, and she exercised these opinions loudly and with great efficiency. James, who was by now nearly 3, received his sister with the uncertain wariness of a child who has not previously shared the stage and is working out his feelings about it, and within a week had decided that she was acceptable, and within a month had appointed himself her official guardian and interpreter, a role he took entirely seriously. The years went on being full. The school grew as Granger's Hollow grew, because the cattle trail continued to bring people and some of them stayed, and Celia found herself in 1884 writing to the school board requesting a second teacher and additional materials, a request she made with such thorough documentation that even Jonas Beckett, who had retired from the board by then, could not have found fault with the argument. The request was approved, and a young woman named Dorothy Ames arrived from Denver to assist, and Celia found in Dorothy a colleague she genuinely liked, someone who shared her belief that a schoolroom should be both rigorous and alive. Seth had, by the mid-1880s, become a man of some standing in the county. Not wealthy, not powerful in the way that the large ranch operations to the south were powerful, but well-regarded, trusted, the kind of man people asked to witness documents and settle disputes, because he was known to be honest and to have no particular stake in most outcomes beyond fairness. He served briefly on the town council in 1885, long enough to push through an ordinance about water access that benefited the smaller ranching operations in the area before stepping back from the formal role because, as he said, he was a rancher by trade and a temporary counselor by reluctant civic duty, and he preferred to keep it that way. He had continued his education, though the formalized Friday lessons of those first months had long since transformed into something more organic, the ongoing conversation of two people who find learning together the most natural thing in the world. He had read widely enough by 1885 that he could hold his own in any discussion Celia cared to have, and frequently pushed that discussion sideways in directions she had not anticipated. His particular fascination remained the natural sciences, astronomy and geology, and the biology of the land they worked, and she had long since stopped being surprised when she found him lying on his back in the pasture on clear nights, staring up at the stars with James beside him doing the same. She would come out to find them like this, father and son flat in the grass with their faces turned to the sky, and James would say, with great authority, the names of the constellations his father had taught him, and Ruth would appear behind Celia wanting to know why her father and brother were lying in the grass, and Celia would take Ruth's hand and they would lie down too, all 4 of them in the late summer warmth. And Seth would point out the patterns above them in the unhurried way of a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be. By 1886, James was 6 and Ruth was 3, and the house on what had stopped being called the Drummond spread some years since and had become, to the surrounding community, simply the Townsend place, had been extended again with a proper covered porch that Seth and Carlos built together over a warm October. The porch faced west, and in the evenings after supper, it was where they most naturally gathered, Seth in the chair he had made from oak, Celia in the rocker that had been Margaret Yates' parting gift when Margaret had finally moved to live near her daughter in Laramie 3 years prior, the children playing in the last light of the day. These evenings were the measure of everything. They talked about the school and the cattle and the books they were reading and the news in the Cheyenne paper, and the children contributed to the conversation with the random, unpredictable energy of children. And the stars came up while they sat there, and the coyotes called in the distance, and the Wyoming Territory spread out around them in all its vast, indifferent beauty. One evening in the autumn of 1886, James came and sat beside his father on the porch steps rather than running in the grass, and he had a particular expression on his face that both of his parents recognized as the expression he wore when he was working up to a serious question. "Papa," James said, "do you know that Mrs. Garrett told her husband that Mama was too smart for a rancher to deserve?" Seth looked at his son. He looked at Celia. Celia looked back at him with an expression he knew very well, the calm raised eyebrow of a woman waiting to see what he was going to do with this. "What do you think about what Mrs. Garrett said?" Seth asked his son. James thought about it. "I think she is wrong," he said, "because you are smart too. You know everything about cattle and stars and why the mountains are where they are. You just learned it different." "You are correct," Seth said. "People can be very smart and also learn in different ways and at different times. That is, in fact, the most important thing I ever learned in school." James looked at his mother. "Mama taught you that," he said. "Your mother taught me a great many things," Seth said, "including some things she did not mean to teach me, simply by being who she is." Celia, from the rocking chair, said nothing. But she pressed her hands together in her lap and looked at her husband and her son in the gathering dark, and she felt the particular completeness of a life that has arrived at exactly the right destination. Ruth appeared from inside the house with a book pressed flat against her chest, a picture book that she had already largely memorized, but that she wanted someone to read to her, and she climbed into Celia's lap with the certainty of a child who has never doubted her welcome, and Celia put her arms around her daughter and opened the book. Seth watched his wife read to their daughter in the lamplight that came through the open door, and he thought about the Friday afternoon in the autumn of 1879, when he had ridden past a one-room schoolhouse and heard a voice through the open window reading about rivers, and he had pulled his horse to a stop and sat listening with his hat in his hands, and then, without quite deciding to, had gone inside and stood at the back of the room like a man who had stumbled into a cathedral and wasn't sure the rules allowed him to stay. He had stayed. She had asked him to come closer. And the distance he had covered since that moment, not in miles but in every other measure that mattered, was something he still, 7 years later, found quietly astonishing. "What are you thinking about?" Celia asked without looking up from the book. Ruth had fallen asleep against her, the picture book still open to an illustration of a mountain. "Classrooms," he said. She looked up then. In the lamplight, her face was exactly the face he had fallen in love with across a schoolteacher's desk in a cold Wyoming winter. And it was also, simultaneously, the face of the woman who had made a home with him, and built a life with him, and argued with him and laughed with him, and lain beside him through 7 years of winters. And it was both of these things at once, the beginning and the middle and the ongoing present, and he did not have a single word for what that meant to him. Only the knowledge that it was the most important fact of his life. "Classrooms," she said, with a small smile. "Specifically the one in Granger's Hollow," he said. "Specifically the back wall of it." She lifted one eyebrow. "And what were you doing at the back wall of it?" "Listening," he said, "to the best teacher I have ever had." She set the book aside carefully, lifted her sleeping daughter with practiced ease, and stood from the rocker. She carried Ruth inside and returned a few minutes later without the child, and she came to stand at the porch rail beside his chair and looked out at the dark land and the stars above it, the same stars she had once taught to 14 children, while a man at the back of the room turned them over in his mind like stones. "I have been thinking," she said, "about writing to the Teachers' College in Cheyenne." They are expanding their program and have asked if any practicing teachers in the territory would contribute to a curriculum guide for frontier schools. You should do it, he said, without hesitation. It would take time in the evenings, she said. I would need the study. The study is yours, he said. It always was. She looked at him, and then she reached down and put her hand over his where it rested on the arm of his chair, and he turned his hand to hold hers, and they stayed like that for a while in the companionable silence that had been one of the best things about them from nearly the beginning. Seth, she said eventually, do you remember what you said the night we were married, on the wagon coming home? He thought. I asked if you were warm enough, he said, before that. I told you the study had 3 shelves, he said, and hoped that was enough to begin. It was more than enough to begin, she said. All of it was. He squeezed her hand. It got bigger, he said. It got considerably bigger, she said, and looked back at the stars. Spring of 1887 came in with the characteristic Wyoming abruptness that Celia had grown accustomed to over the years. Snow one week and muddy thaw the next. The cattle restless with the change in weather. The children in the schoolroom equally restless in sympathy with the season. Dorothy Ames had by now been teaching alongside Celia for 3 years and had become a dear friend. And they managed the school together with a complementary rhythm. Dorothy's warm, impulsive teaching style balancing Celia's more structured approach in a way that benefited the children enormously. James started school that autumn, which produced in Celia a complex set of emotions that she discussed at some length with Seth. The strangeness of one's own child being a student, the desire to not extend favoritism, the competing desire to ensure he received every advantage. Seth had listened to all of this and then said with characteristic quietness, "He's going to be fine. He comes from good stock." "That is the most rancher thing you have ever said," she told him. "I am a rancher," he said. James was, as it turned out, fine, better than fine. He was the student that teachers remember, not because he was the easiest or the best behaved, he was neither, but because he was genuinely alive to ideas in a way that made teaching feel like its own reward. He had his father's gift for making unexpected connections and his mother's precision with language, and Dorothy Ames reported to Celia at the end of his first month that teaching him was, and she chose the word carefully, invigorating. Celia had laughed and then thought, yes. Yes, that is exactly what it feels like. In the spring of 1888, a letter arrived from Celia's sister Ruth in Ohio, saying that their father had suffered a serious illness over the winter and was recovered but diminished, and that the family thought perhaps Celia should plan to visit in the summer if she was able. Celia brought the letter to Seth in the evening and he read it carefully and looked at her. "You should go," he said. "Take as long as you need. I can manage here with the help of Carlos and Emilio, and Dorothy can manage the school." "It is a very long journey," she said. "The children, I will take care of the children," he said. "Take James and Ruth with you if you want them, or leave them with me. Either way works." She looked at him. "You would not be lonely?" she asked. He considered this honestly, which was how he considered everything. "I would be lonely," he said, "but I would know you were coming back, and that makes it different." She took the children and made the journey to Ohio in July, a long trip by rail from Cheyenne, and she arrived in the town of her childhood to find her father older and quieter than she remembered, but glad to see her with a wholeness that made the journey entirely worthwhile. She stayed 6 weeks, and her sisters Ruth and Anna and their families were there for much of that time. And James ran in the Ohio summer with cousins he had never met, and Ruth made a firm friend of Ruth the sister, who was delighted to have a namesake, and the whole visit had a quality of reunion and restoration. She wrote to Seth from Ohio every week, long letters full of everything she was seeing and feeling, and his replies came back measured and steady. The written voice she had first encountered in a letter to his brother, and which had developed over the years into something entirely itself. He wrote about the cattle and the weather and the neighbors, and he wrote about James's bedroom, which he had repainted while they were away, because he had noticed James had mentioned wanting it to be blue. And he wrote about finding Ruth's doll under the kitchen chair and putting it on her pillow so it would be there when she got home. She read that last part 3 times on the porch of her father's house in the Ohio summer and held the letter in her lap for a long while afterward. She came home in September, the children travel-weary and full of stories, and Seth met them at the stage stop in town, and she stepped down from the stage and he was there, exactly as she had always found him when she needed him to be, solid and present and real. He held out his hand and she took it, and Ruth launched herself from the step of the stage into his arms, and James, who at 7 years old had decided that excessive demonstrations of affection were beneath his dignity, shook his father's hand with enormous seriousness and then could not maintain it and hugged him around the middle. "I missed you," Celia said simply. "I missed you," he said. "The house is very quiet when you are not in it. I noticed Ohio was very loud," she said. "The comparison is clarifying." He smiled, and they walked toward the wagon together, the children running ahead, and the September light lay across the Wyoming hills in that particular afternoon gold that she had grown to love, and Granger's Hollow spread around them, solid and familiar, and she thought, as she thought often, that she had come here thinking it was simply the position that was available, and had found instead a life she could not have imagined earning. The years moved forward, and Celia and Seth Townsend moved through them with the steadiness of people who know what they are building and are committed to the building of it. The cattle operation continued to grow carefully, never overextended, always managed with the long-term view that had been Seth's approach to everything since he had bought the Drummond land. By 1890, the herd stood at 200 head, and they had taken on 2 additional hands, and the Townsend spread was recognized throughout the county as a well-managed operation of honest dealing. The school had grown too, now requiring 3 teachers to serve the expanding town, and Celia had taken on an informal supervisory role that was not formally titled because formal titles would have required school board approval, and Jonas Beckett, though retired, remained a periodic voice in local affairs. She managed the situation with the same steady pragmatism she brought to everything, doing the work regardless of whether the title existed. She completed the curriculum guide for the Teachers' College in Cheyenne in 1889, a document of considerable length and depth that was subsequently adopted by 17 frontier schools in Wyoming and Colorado, a fact she learned in a letter from the college's director that arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, and which she read 3 times standing in the kitchen before telling Seth. He read the letter. He set it down on the table. 17 schools, he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her with that expression she knew, the one that was too large for its container. "Are you surprised?" he asked. "A little," she said honestly. "I thought perhaps 3 or 4 might find it useful." "The rest of them were just slower to notice," he said. She took the letter from the table and held it. "When I was at the Teachers' College," she said, "the director told me that frontier teaching was admirable, but that the real work of education happened in the established cities, that the frontier was too irregular to develop lasting educational methods." "And," Seth said, "and I thought he was wrong," she said, "but I was 22 and uncertain about a great many things." "I am not uncertain about that anymore. You have never been uncertain about the important things," he said, "not from the first week I knew you." She looked at him across the kitchen in the late afternoon light. "I was uncertain about you," she said, "for approximately 3 weeks. And then?" he asked. "And then you fixed the stove damper," she said, "and sat in front of a fire with me talking about things that mattered, and I stopped being uncertain." He stood and came around the table, and she leaned into him with the ease of a woman who has been leaning into the same man for nearly 10 years and has found him consistently worthy of it. His arms came around her, and she held the letter from the Teachers' College against her chest and felt the warmth of him and the weight of the years they had built, all of it real and solid and present. 3 weeks, he said, into her hair. "I was not uncertain for a single day after the first one. That is because you are stubborn," she said. "Persistent," he said. "There is a distinction." There is a distinction, she agreed. You were never at the back of my room again after that first day I asked you to come closer. I never needed to be, he said. You gave me reason to come forward. She tilted her head back to look at him. He looked back, his eyes the same warm, serious color they had been in the autumn of 1879 when he had stood with his hat in his hands in her doorway, wondering if the room had space for him. It always did, she said. There was always space, Seth, from the very beginning. He kissed her in the kitchen, with the Wyoming afternoon light coming through the window and the letter from 17 schools held in her hand. And it was a kiss that had 10 years of Fridays in it, and all the lessons learned, and all the distance crossed, and all the cold winters survived, and all the good evenings on the porch, and all the children's laughter, and all the quiet conversations in the study by lamplight. Everything that they had built from the moment he had stopped his gray horse outside a one-room schoolhouse and heard a woman's voice teaching about rivers. James came in from outside, stopped in the kitchen doorway, assessed the situation, and retreated with the dignity of a 9-year-old who has decided that whatever his parents are doing is not his business, which was, Celia thought, another thing she could safely say she had taught him. Ruth came in behind him, less interested in dignity, and announced that she was hungry and that there was a bird building a nest in the barn and that she had decided she wanted to learn to ride properly this summer, not just being led around, actually ride. We can arrange that, Seth said. Mama should learn too, Ruth announced. Mama rides like she is apologizing to the horse. I ride perfectly adequately, Celia said, which was broadly true and a little narrowly false. Papa will teach you both, Ruth said, with the confidence of a 5-year-old who has decided how things will be organized and when to find something to eat. Seth looked at Celia. She looked at him. The kitchen was full of the ordinary life of a family in full operation. The smells of supper beginning and the sounds of children somewhere in the house, and the late light making the room golden. And it was ordinary in the way that only the best things are ordinary, the kind of ordinary that you build carefully and tend faithfully, and that becomes, over years, the most extraordinary thing you have. The autumn of 1890 brought changes to Granger's Hollow. The way the 1880s closing into the 1890s brought changes everywhere in the territory. The railroad had come through a nearby town and altered the patterns of commerce, and the cattle trail that had built Granger's Hollow was less central than it had been. But the town had grown enough to be self-sustaining by now, and it adapted, as small towns that have decided to be permanent generally do. Seth's older brother Henry came to visit from Texas that autumn, the first of his family Seth had seen in nearly 12 years. He arrived by rail and then by stage, a big man with Seth's same jaw and their mother's eyes, and he stood on the porch of the Townsend place and looked around at the land and the house and the barn and the cattle visible in the pasture and said, "You did all right, brother." "I did all right," Seth agreed. Henry stayed for 2 weeks and got along with Celia in the way of people who are able to recognize in each other a genuine commitment to the person they both love. He was not as educated as his brother had become, but he was shrewd and observant, and on the last evening of his visit, sitting on the porch while the children were inside and the stars were coming up, he told Seth that he had been worried about him for a long time. "Worried about what?" Seth asked. "Worried you would spend your whole life riding away from things," Henry said, "that you would never find a place to stop." Seth looked at the house, at the lamplight coming through the study window where Celia was working on something at the desk inside. "I stopped," he said. "She stopped you," Henry said, not critically, simply observationally. "No," Seth said. "She gave me reason to stop myself. There is a distinction." Henry looked at him and then at the study window. "She is something," he said. "She is entirely everything," Seth said. Henry left the following morning, and Seth and Celia stood on the porch watching the wagon take him toward town, and she put her hand through his arm and leaned her head against his shoulder. "Your brother is a good man," she said. "He is," Seth said. "He always was." "It is good that he came," she said. Some things should not wait too long. He put his hand over hers on his arm. No, he said, they should not. The winter of 1891 was mild by Wyoming standards, and Christmas that year was large and loud, Henry having promised to come again, and having kept his promise, and Celia's sister Ruth arriving from Ohio with her husband and their 3 children, and the Townsend house containing more people than it had ever contained, which it managed on the strength of the additions Seth had built and the organizational ability of Celia, who ran the domestic logistics of the gathering with the same clear-headed precision she brought to the school curriculum. James, 10 years old, appointed himself guide and host to the visiting cousins. Ruth, now 8, performed an extensive program of showing her Ohio cousin Emma the barn and the horses and the stars, which she named with the confidence of a child who has been educated by a father who lies in the grass at night and points at the sky. On Christmas Eve, after the children were in bed and the visiting adults had dispersed to their sleeping arrangements, Celia and Seth sat at the kitchen table with tea, and the house was quiet around them in the particular way of houses that have been full and are now temporarily emptied, still warm with what had been in them. "Do you remember our first Christmas in Granger's Hollow?" she asked. "We danced," he said. "Twice." "You counted the dances," she said. "I was aware that 2 was the limit propriety allowed," he said. "I was very aware of it." She smiled into her tea. "What would you have done if there had been a 3rd dance?" He considered this with the serious expression he brought to hypothetical questions. "I think I would have asked for it and faced the consequences," he said. She laughed. "Jonas Beckett would have had a great deal to say about it." "Jonas Beckett had a great deal to say about everything," Seth said. "It did not change the outcome of anything." She looked at him across the table, at the lines that years of Wyoming weather had added to his face, at the gray that had begun at his temples, at the eyes that were the same as they had always been, steady and warm and serious in a way that had always meant something to her. "Seth," she said, "if you could go back and change anything, any single thing." He looked at her for a moment. "I would have knocked on the door," he said, "that first Friday, instead of standing in the back and hoping no one noticed I was there. And if you had knocked on the door," she said, "and walked in and introduced yourself properly, then we might have started earlier," he said. "We lost weeks." "Did not lose them," she said. "We needed them. You needed to stand at the back for a little while, and I needed to wonder about you." "Did you wonder?" he asked. "Constantly," she said. "For 4 weeks I wondered." He reached across the table and took her hand, and his thumb moved over the silver band with its turquoise stone, worn smooth now with 11 years of being on her finger. "And when you finally asked me to come closer," he said, "I wondered why I had waited 4 weeks," she said. He smiled, and she thought, as she had thought before and would think again, that his smile was the thing she most wanted to see in a room, above all other beautiful and interesting things. "We have done well," he said. "I think we have done very well." "We have done very well," she said. "We are not finished yet." "No," he said, "not even close." Outside the kitchen window, the Wyoming winter had settled into one of its clear, cold, beautiful nights, the sky enormous and dense with stars, the constellations that James could name and Ruth could name, and that Seth had learned from a woman who had stood at a blackboard with a hand-drawn diagram of the solar system, and said, "The light from some stars has been traveling so long that the star itself might already be gone by the time that light reaches your eye." They sat at the table in the warm kitchen of the house they had built together, and held hands across the plain wood surface, and the fire in the stove was steady, and the children slept in their rooms, and the cattle were settled in the barn, and the study shelves that had started with 3 were now full, and the land outside was theirs, worked and known and cared for, and the years ahead were still opening in front of them like a long, clear morning. It was everything. It was, without any reservation or remaining uncertainty, entirely everything. And somewhere in the town of Granger's Hollow, the schoolhouse stood in the winter dark, its pine-board walls holding the memory of 100 Friday afternoons, of chalk on a blackboard and children's voices, and a man in a worn leather coat leaning against the back wall with his hat in his hands, listening to the best teacher he had ever heard, not yet knowing that what he was really listening to was the beginning of his own life. He had stood there until she had told him to come closer. And he had spent every day since moving in exactly that direction.